Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
James looked around the table and felt something he couldn't quite explain. It was like watching his own life from the outside. People were toasting enthusiastically, laughing, complimenting the decor and the menu, but his mind was moving at a different pace. 20 years of marriage. A number that, for many there, meant stability, respect, maturity. And that's why they were all gathered in that carefully chosen restaurant, celebrating the lasting love between him and Vanessa. At least, that's what everyone believed. Everything was going as expected until James stepped away for a moment to use the restroom. He wasn't running from the moment, he just needed a second alone. As soon as he walked in, he noticed another man leaning near the sink, looking tense. When their eyes met, the guy took a deep breath and stepped closer. Someone James didn't recognize, maybe a guest from a distant relative. And what he said was straight to the point: "Your wife put something in your drink." The sentence hung in the air like time had frozen. James didn't know how to respond. He looked around, trying to figure out if this was a terrible joke, some kind of misunderstanding, or if the guy was just drunk. But the man's eyes said more than words. He didn't seem like someone making up a story. There was distress in his gaze, the kind of look that comes from carrying a heavy weight and finally wanting to let it go. James swallowed hard and walked out without saying a word. His mind, previously calm, snapped into alert mode. He sat back down at the table and forced a smile, trying to reconnect with the dinner's atmosphere. While Vanessa chatted with her sister about a trip they were planning, James watched her. She was animated, smiling, gesturing naturally. Her wine glass was still untouched. His was nearly full too. He couldn't stop staring at the two glasses. He thought about all the times he'd trusted blindly. He remembered defending Vanessa, even when family members hinted she seemed distant. He thought about Ellie, their daughter, probably sleeping at home, believing her parents still loved each other the way they always appeared to. That doubt, however absurd, was enough for him to do something he'd never imagined doing in a moment like this. While everyone else was distracted, he quietly switched the glasses. The one meant for him now sat in front of Vanessa, and vice versa. The party went on, conversations continued, but his eyes never left her. It only took a few minutes. Vanessa started touching her arms, as if feeling sudden discomfort. She laughed at something no one had said. Then she frowned, like she'd lost track of the conversation. James saw the light in her eyes change. It wasn't tiredness. It wasn't the alcohol. It was something different, something chemical. Something real. She ran a hand over her face, adjusted her hair, and said she needed to go to the bathroom. Her cousin asked if she was okay, and Vanessa just gave an awkward smile, saying it was just a brief dizziness. James offered to go with her, but she declined, preferring to go alone. And so she did. He watched her until she disappeared down the hallway. His heart pounded, like it wanted to escape. He took a deep breath and did everything he could to hide his emotions. He kept talking with his uncles about a new investment company. He politely responded to jokes from a coworker. He played the role of the perfect husband in front of everyone. But inside, his world was shifting. Everything he thought he knew had been thrown into question. The idea that someone he loved could do something so low made him want to stand up and demand answers right then. But still, he chose to wait. Because silence, at this point, was stronger than any accusation. It was as if fate had given him a chance to observe, to listen, to see things clearly. And he realized that if he had the courage to look at what was right in front of him, he might find a truth that would free him from living another 20 years in a lie. Vanessa's return to the table was quick. She said she felt better after splashing water on her face. She smiled like nothing had happened. Then they toasted again, as if everything was perfectly fine. But from that moment on, James stopped being just a devoted husband. He became a man who needed to know. Needed to understand who he had really been married to. Because one thing was certain, that night had changed something inside him. And no broken glass would ever make more noise than the silence he decided to carry from that point on. James spent the next 2 days trying to sort his thoughts. The image of Vanessa confused, minutes after he switched the glasses, kept replaying in his mind like a reminder that something had changed. That moment marked a line. He didn't know exactly what she had put in his drink, but he couldn't ignore the warning. And no matter how hard he tried to keep living as if everything were normal, he had already crossed the line between instinct and action. On Wednesday, he called a guy from the office. Someone who, months earlier, had mentioned a private investigator known for discretion and efficiency. He wrote down the number, saved it under a generic name on his phone, and called that same afternoon. He set up a meeting in a quiet place. The investigator, Neil, seemed experienced. He listened without interrupting, took a few notes, and then asked the most important question: "Do you suspect someone specific?" James hesitated. He was afraid to say the name out loud. But something inside pushed him to do it. "Patrick. My brother." Just saying it aloud made him feel like he was betraying his own family. But keeping that possibility locked inside would be worse. Neil started right away. He asked for phone records, days and times when Vanessa usually ran errands. James handed over everything. In the following days, he forced himself to act normal. He came home, had dinner with his daughter, asked his wife how her day had been. Vanessa seemed lighter than ever. She smiled, talked about work, made vacation plans. The more she spoke, the more James realized he didn't know who he was married to. On Friday night, Neil called and asked to meet. They met at a cafe away from the city center. James arrived and went straight to the point. Neil handed him an envelope. Inside were security camera images, screenshots of online reservations made under fake identities, and records of movements at 3 different hotels. Always on Wednesdays. Always at the same times. And then came the hardest blow: Patrick appeared in the photos. Complicit, relaxed, smiling. The two of them walked in together, checked in discreetly, and left about 2 hours later. James flipped through the photos in silence. Then he stopped and rubbed his face. The betrayal was documented. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was fact. And worse, the woman he shared his life with and the man he shared his childhood with were side by side against him. His heart ached, but his mind grew clearer. He didn't need more proof. That was enough. On the way home, James decided he'd wait for Vanessa to arrive. He couldn't pretend anymore. When she walked in, he called her straight into the living room. Ellie was already asleep in her room. She was surprised by his tone, asked if something had happened, but he just told her to sit down. He picked up the envelope he'd left on the table and pushed it toward her. "Open it." She hesitated for a second, then pulled out the pages. As she turned each one, her expression changed. She tried to stay composed, but her eyes showed shock. And when she reached the last photo, she looked up and said, "You went far." James crossed his arms, unblinking. "Yeah, I did. You want to tell me, or should I keep showing you more?" Vanessa dropped the papers on the table and leaned back in her chair. She gave a dry laugh. "You've always been obsessed with control. Now here you are, with your truth. And what does that change?" Her indifference burned like acid. He responded in a firm but controlled voice. "It changes that it's over. It changes that I won't sleep next to someone who smiles at me in the morning after being with my brother. It changes that I've already filed for divorce and this house is only in my name." She stared at him for a few seconds, maybe hoping for a crack, an emotion, a chance to manipulate the situation. But James stayed still. He just told her she had until the end of the week to pack and leave. And before she could say anything, he went upstairs, entered his daughter's room, and stayed by her side until she fell asleep. The decision wasn't easy, but in that moment, it was final. The confrontation brought relief. For the first time in a long time, James felt he had taken back control of his life. No shouting, no drama. Just facts. And the truth, naked and printed on the living room table, was all he needed to move forward. Vanessa left the house on Sunday afternoon, carrying 2 suitcases and a look James didn't try to read. She didn't ask for forgiveness, nor did she show regret. She passed through the living room in silence while Ellie slept in her room. The door closed behind her slowly, without urgency, without a scene, without a goodbye. James didn't get up, didn't say anything. He just stayed there, sitting, staring at the empty spot where the wedding photo used to be, the one he'd taken down the morning before. Vanessa's immediate absence didn't bring relief. It brought a new kind of silence. Not the tense silence of the past few months, but a raw, steady silence that was hard to understand. It was as if the house was relearning how to breathe. In the first few days, James avoided touching anything that reminded him of his ex-wife. Not out of longing, but because his body hadn't yet realized that chapter was truly closed. He woke up earlier, moved through the house carefully, as if she were still there. It took time for his mind to accept that the betrayal wasn't just a suspicion or a hidden pain, it was a finished chapter. With Ellie, he was honest but careful. He explained that her mom would have a new place to live, but she'd still see her daughter whenever she wanted. He assured her that didn't change the love she received. And when the girl asked why, James answered with the kind of truth a 9-year-old could understand: sometimes the people we love make bad choices, and the best way to deal with that is to move forward with what we still have that's good. She hugged him and didn't ask again. Without Vanessa, the house slowly settled into a new routine. James started filling his time with things he'd let go of. He got back into cooking simple dinners, like he used to at the beginning of the marriage. He replaced the living room sofa, painted a wall, changed the pictures. These weren't impulsive acts. They were ways of telling himself this house wasn't a stage for lies anymore. It was his new space with his daughter. But the strangest part was realizing that, despite everything, he still thought about Patrick. The betrayal by his brother hurt differently. Deeper. It was like losing not just a marriage, but his entire family history. This was the boy who shared his room for years, who taught him how to ride a bike, who cried beside him at their father's funeral. And now he was the man sleeping with his wife behind his back, using fake names at cheap hotels, laughing at everything they once shared. James even started writing a letter to him, but tore it up before finishing. Nothing he said would change what had already been done. One day, while picking Ellie up from school, he saw Vanessa across the street, leaning against a car. She was on her phone, smiling. It was the same old smile, but something about it now seemed fake. She saw him, but looked away. James didn't react. He got in the car with his daughter and carried on with the day as if it had been just another random scene. There was no more room inside him to feed anger. Resentment had given way to a quiet resignation. Vanessa had made her choices. And he had made his. The late afternoons, which once felt too long, started gaining a new rhythm. He began listening to music again. He read more, without getting lost in dark thoughts. His daughter laughed more too. Sometimes they danced in the living room, other times they played cards late into the night. The pain was still there, but now it came in spaced-out waves, ones he knew how to face. He wasn't living for what he'd lost anymore, but for what he was rebuilding. On an ordinary Saturday, Ellie asked if her dad still loved her mom. James looked at her warmly and said he had loved her a lot, for a long time, but now what he felt was different. That he hoped her mom would find peace, even if it was far from them. And that his love for Ellie would never change. She smiled, as if that was all she needed to hear. That house, now quieter, was slowly becoming a real home. James discovered, little by little, that he didn't need revenge, or answers, or perfect explanations. He just needed to keep moving, without carrying what no longer served him. Vanessa's departure wasn't the end. It was the beginning of what he'd long been afraid to pursue, a clean, honest life built on truth, even when it hurt. For weeks, James rehearsed what he'd say to Patrick. During the quietest days, he even imagined his brother showing up at the door, trying to explain. But he never came. No messages. No apologies. It was like, by taking Vanessa, he'd also taken the courage to face the consequences. That hurt more than the betrayal itself. James didn't expect redemption, but he'd hoped for at least a sign of humanity. And all he got was silence. Until one Friday, as he was leaving a supermarket with Ellie, James saw Patrick's car parked across the street. He was leaning against the door, talking on the phone. When he saw his brother, he froze for a second. Ellie recognized him too. "Dad, is that Uncle Pat?" James took a deep breath and answered calmly. "Yeah, sweetheart. Wait in the car for a sec." She obeyed. He crossed the street without thinking twice. Patrick hung up the phone. He tried to smile, like this was just another casual meeting. But his eyes showed the discomfort his body was trying to hide. James stopped less than 2 meters away, steady. There was no more doubt, no hesitation. Just a clear need to close something that had stayed open too long. "I just want one answer," James began. "At what point in our story did you think sleeping with my wife was okay?" Patrick looked down, like searching for words on the ground. But James didn't want excuses. "I didn't come here to hear apologies. I just wanted to see up close what's left of the man I used to call brother." Patrick tried to speak, but stammered. Said it was a mistake, things got out of control, it wasn't supposed to happen like this. But James only heard noise. The bond between them was already broken. There was no patching it. Just wreckage. "You stabbed me with the dirtiest knife possible. And you didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye after. You hid. You had the guts to betray me, but not to face me." Patrick tried to justify, saying Vanessa had been unhappy for a long time. James cut him off, firm. "You don't get to use her unhappiness as an excuse. If she wanted out, fine. But you? You were my brother." The silence between them grew heavier than any words. James took a deep breath. What needed to be said had been said. But before walking away, he looked one last time into his brother's eyes and finished. "I'm raising my daughter alone now. And that makes me a more complete man than you'll ever be. You and Vanessa deserve each other. I hope one day you realize the kind of people you've become." He turned and walked back across the street, not caring if his brother was still watching. He got in the car, smiled at Ellie, and asked if she wanted to stop by the ice cream shop. She said yes. And in that moment, James felt something different, freedom. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.